At dawn on June 6, 1944, the world shifted on its axis. The sea, dark and churning beneath an overcast sky, was suddenly alive with the deafening roar of war. Waves of Allied soldiers, their landing craft cutting through the surf, began to hit the beaches of Normandy. The German forces, entrenched in their so-called Atlantic Wall, had no reason to believe this day would be anything but a minor skirmish. The Nazis had constructed their defenses with confidence, expecting any invasion to come in the Pas-de-Calais, further north. But in Normandy, the Allies had found their weak spot. What had been dismissed as improbable was unfolding in the worst possible way for Germany. The German High Command had underestimated the will and reach of the Allied forces. They believed the coastline of Normandy was too vulnerable, too difficult for a full-scale invasion. Their soldiers were stationed far from the beachhead, scattered across a vast network of bunkers and fortifications, each more imposing than the last. Yet the Allies arrived anyway, their combined naval and air superiority overwhelming the defenders. In a cruel irony, the very strength of the German defenses became their downfall. They had placed too much faith in concrete walls, barbed wire, and mines, believing those fortifications could hold back the tide of history. Within hours, the reality of the invasion set in. The Germans, shocked and disoriented, were slow to react. Communications were chaotic. Some commanders, still convinced that the landings were a diversion, ordered counterattacks that came too late and in the wrong places. Confusion ran through the ranks. Men in the field looked toward their superiors for guidance, but many were equally uncertain about the invasion's scale or purpose. It was as if, in the heart of battle, Germany's once unshakable sense of control began to crumble. The irony of it all was that the Germans had, in their overconfidence, failed to adapt to the changing nature of warfare. Their resistance to flexibility, to the possibility of a Normandy landing, would become the beginning of their undoing. With each beachhead the Allies secured, a piece of their mythic stronghold slipped away. But what they didn't know was that the weapon they mocked, an invasion made possible by hundreds of thousands of men, ships, and planes, would soon erase their advantage entirely. As the first light of dawn faded, a new chapter in the war had already begun. The Germans were trapped in a war of attrition they could no longer control, and the full extent of their miscalculations would soon become impossible to ignore. In the coming days, Allied forces would move deeper into the heart of France, but they wouldn't be alone in this struggle. Deep within the walls of the Reich, a new, unseen force was beginning to stir. As the year 1943 drew to a close, the high command of the German military sat at the apex of their dominance in Europe. Yet in their most secure offices, they failed to see the cracks beginning to form. Allied forces, despite their best efforts to remain elusive, were preparing for something monumental. But the German generals, ensconced in their fortified positions, refused to believe it. The idea that the Allies would choose Normandy for their invasion seemed absurd to them. A fool's errand, in fact. The Pas-de-Calais, the shortest point between England and France, was the obvious location. Everyone knew that. The Allies wouldn't risk the unpredictability of the open sea when they could strike closer to their home base. This belief was not a matter of chance. It was rooted in years of military tradition, in the pride of a force that had never truly faced a threat it couldn't absorb or outsmart. German intelligence reports, though filled with clues, were dismissed. The Allies, they reasoned, were not capable of the kind of deception required for a successful misdirection. The notion of a massive Allied force massing in the south of France seemed too complex, too ambitious. Their intelligence had been consistent in predicting a strike at the Pas-de-Calais, and the generals, confident in their interpretations, neglected to consider the possibility that the enemy might think differently. At the same time, the Germans had been heavily invested in the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a vast network of fortifications stretching from Norway to the Pyrenees. Every inch of it was designed to thwart any attack from the sea, an impenetrable defense that they believed would be the death knell for any amphibious invasion. And yet, in their arrogance, they underestimated the will and ingenuity of the Allied forces. The belief that the Atlantic Wall could hold back the tide of war was as firm as concrete, but the reality of its limits would soon become apparent. By the time Allied forces began to assemble in secret for what would become the D-Day invasion, the Germans were still convinced the assault would come at Pas-de-Calais. The officers, Ned to oversee Normandy were few and far between, their presence a mere token. As the Allies made their final preparations, the German High Command remained passive, too absorbed in their own certainty to heed the mounting evidence that the tide of war was about to shift in ways they had not imagined. And so, when the first wave of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, it was not just a surprise. It was a catastrophe born from overconfidence and a catastrophic underestimation of the enemy. But as the first explosions lit up the skies above the beaches, another question lingered. How much longer could the Germans ignore the enemy's true power? And could the Atlantic Wall, the fortress they had so carefully constructed, hold out long enough to change the course of history? At first light on June 6, 1944, the German commanders along the coast of Normandy could scarcely believe their eyes. The distant thunder of artillery fire, the shriek of incoming bombs, this was no drill, no false alarm. It was real, and it was unfolding before them. In the span of just a few hours, the Allies had transformed the coastline into a theater of chaos. The beaches, once quiet and empty, were suddenly filled with the sound of engines, the rush of waves, and the cries of men struggling to survive against the pounding force of an invasion that seemed impossible only days before. German commanders, scattered across their positions, were caught utterly off guard. The irony of it all was almost palpable. The generals, so confident in their preparations, had been led astray by their own arrogance. They had dismissed the possibility of a major Allied assault on Normandy, even as subtle signs of the invasion grew clearer by the day. Operation Fortitude, a carefully crafted deception, had convinced them that the true landing would occur at the Pas-de-Calais. The sheer brilliance of this misinformation campaign worked too well, clouding the German command's perception. They had underestimated the will and determination of the Allies, believing their own strength and the might of the Atlantic Wall would be enough to halt any force that dared to challenge them. But as the Allied forces stormed ashore, it became immediately clear that the Germans were unprepared for the scale of the assault. Their forces were scattered and disorganized, each sector operating in isolation from the others. Officers, still believing that the invasion was a mere diversion, were delayed in responding, leaving the defending troops without clear leadership or coordination. In this confusion, the Allies pressed forward, with relentless energy, seizing key positions before the Germans had the chance to react. The Atlantic Wall, once thought impenetrable, was proving to be a mere illusion, crumbling under the weight of the onslaught. Even as the battle raged, the Germans struggled to make sense of the situation. Their initial belief that the landings were an impossible dream was now a nightmare come to life. The tide of battle had turned with stunning speed, and the realization began to set in. The D-Day invasion, once an idea too ambitious to be real, was now a reality. The Allies were not retreating, and they were not bluffing. They were here to stay. With each wave of Allied reinforcements flooding in, Germany's hold on Normandy slipped further. As the first cracks appeared in the once imposing Atlantic Wall, the question remained: could they regroup and mount a defense in time to change the course of the invasion? Or had they already lost the initiative for good? As 1944 unfolded, the German command maintained an unwavering belief in their supremacy along the coast of France. For them, the Atlantic Wall was more than just a series of fortifications. It was an embodiment of their unshakable confidence. From the cliffs of Normandy to the beaches below, the Germans had created what they considered an impenetrable defense. Concrete bunkers, minefields, and artillery positions stretched as far as the eye could see, a testament to their perceived invulnerability. The commanders believed that no Allied force, however large or determined, could breach this stronghold. They had prepared for the worst, hadn't they? The irony of this belief was almost unbearable. Despite a flood of intelligence reports indicating the possibility of an invasion at Normandy, the German High Command stubbornly dismissed these warnings. The Allies had been deceptive in their movements, but the Germans, blinded by their own sense of invincibility, couldn't see it. Even when Allied forces began to assemble in the south of England, the strategic significance of Normandy remained lost on the men who held the reins of power. To them, the shortest route from England to France was at the Pas-de-Calais, not the rugged coastline of Normandy. They were certain that any true invasion would come there. The Atlantic Wall was their answer to any threat, an elaborate security blanket that gave them false comfort in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary. In truth, the German defenses were static, designed for a battle of attrition rather than one of speed and mobility. While the Allies were building momentum, consolidating their strength, The German strategy remained rooted in a stationary defense, ill-suited for rapid responses. The leadership's focus was too rigid, too fixed on the belief that their fortifications would hold. What they failed to grasp was that modern warfare demanded more than just solid defenses. It demanded flexibility, adaptability, and speed. These were qualities that the Atlantic Wall could not provide. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, one of Germany's most experienced commanders, saw the cracks in this strategy. He urged for reinforcements, for the rapid deployment of mobile units to counter any invasion. His warnings went unheeded. Hitler, convinced that the Allies would strike at the Pas-de-Calais, overruled Rommel's pleas for action, insisting that the Atlantic Wall was enough. This decision would prove disastrous. The Germans, entrenched in their own certainties, failed to respond quickly enough. Their hesitation left the beaches of Normandy vulnerable, and by the time they realized their mistake, it was already too late. In the chaos of June 6, 1944, the true cost of their overconfidence became clear. What began as a fortress, seemingly impenetrable, became a symbol of their downfall. The failure to adapt, to heed the warnings of their most capable commanders, had allowed the Allies to strike with devastating force. The Germans were no longer in control of the situation, and the tides of war began to shift irreversibly. But in the days ahead, there would be those in the Reich who would try to reverse the tide, though their chances were growing slimmer by the hour. As the Allies pushed forward, one question remained. Could the German military ever regain the initiative? Or had the decisions made in the months leading to D-Day already sealed their fate? As the first waves of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Germans were already mired in a battle of confusion. Officers, spread across a vast network of coastal defenses, struggled to coordinate any meaningful response to the unexpected invasion. Communications were slow, fragmented by both distance and the sheer scale of the operation unfolding before them. At the core of this disarray was a single critical question. Where was the main thrust of the Allied assault? Was it in Normandy, or was this merely a diversion, a feint to draw attention away from the real invasion? German forces were paralyzed by indecision, each command center awaiting orders from higher up the chain of command, but none could act quickly enough to counter the rapidly advancing Allied forces. The irony of this moment was striking. Germany, with one of the most extensive and sophisticated intelligence networks in the world, failed to make the most of it when it mattered most. Despite having intercepted signals, gathered reconnaissance, and received reports from numerous sources, the German High Command remained convinced that Normandy was only a distraction. The belief that the true attack would come elsewhere, likely at the Pas-de-Calais, held a tight grip on their strategy. Even with compelling evidence suggesting otherwise, the German command was paralyzed by their own overconfidence. Their intelligence reports seemed to confirm their bias, reinforcing their conviction that they had already accounted for every possibility. Hitler's refusal to grant his generals the authority to act quickly only deepened the paralysis. Despite urgent reports, the Führer insisted that no major response could be made until his grand vision was in place. In the critical hours following the invasion, when swift action could have altered the course of the battle, his generals were left to wait, unsure of what they were allowed to do, while the Allies poured in. This delay in decision-making allowed the Allies to seize key positions, to entrench themselves on the beaches and beyond, creating a foothold that would prove increasingly difficult for the Germans to dislodge. Compounding the confusion was Operation Fortitude, the Allies' brilliant deception campaign. Through a combination of fake radio traffic, phantom armies, and deliberate misinformation, the Allies created the illusion of a massive buildup in the Pas-de-Calais. German intelligence, already stretched thin by the scale of the operation, bought into this deception. The result was a fractured response, with forces dispatched to the wrong locations, further complicating the German ability to act cohesively. In essence, the Germans had been outplayed at their own game of intelligence and strategy. By the time the Germans began to recognize the magnitude of the assault in Normandy, the Allies had already established a strong foothold. The failure to respond swiftly, the inability to adapt. Indeed, the strategic miscalculations of the German command had irreparably weakened their position. The battle for Normandy was no longer a question of if, but how much damage would the Germans be able to inflict before they were driven from the beaches? The question that remained was this: how long could they hold out before the tide of history carried them away? In the coming days, the Allies would press forward, but the Germans were not done yet. Desperate measures were already in motion as they looked for a way to regain control. Could they? Or had their moments of hesitation sealed their fate? In the early hours of June 6, 1944, as the first waves of Allied forces poured onto the beaches of Normandy, the German High Command was still clinging to a critical belief. The invasion was a feint, a deception. They had prepared for an attack at the Pas-de-Calais, where the English Channel was narrowest. The point they believed was the Allies' most likely landing site. The forces massing in Normandy, still 1,000 miles away from the primary theater of war, were seen as a distraction, a trick to draw attention away from the real invasion that would come. Hitler, blinded by his own stubborn convictions, refused to allow his generals the flexibility to act. The belief in the Atlantic Wall, the seemingly impregnable system of fortifications along the French coast, only strengthened their certainty. And so, with the Allies already landing, the response from the German High Command was sluggish, disjointed, and ultimately too late. The irony of this situation was staggering. Despite having one of the most advanced intelligence networks in the world, Germany failed to grasp the significance of what was unfolding before them. Reports from the field, radio intercepts, and reconnaissance photos all pointed toward an invasion at Normandy. Yet, the Germans refused to believe it. They could not fathom that the Allies would risk the challenges of a landing in such a difficult location. The miscalculation was compounded by a deadly combination of arrogance and overconfidence. The belief that the Atlantic Wall could hold the Allies at bay, combined with Hitler's rigid refusal to accept alternate viewpoints, paralyzed German command. As the first reinforcements were delayed, key opportunities slipped away. The early failure to respond left the Allies a crucial window to establish vital beachheads. By the time German forces began to regroup and mobilize, much of the ground they needed to contest had already been seized. The Allies, with their air superiority and massive logistical resources, poured in more men, more tanks, and more artillery. Each beach was secured in the face of fierce resistance, but the Germans, scattered and confused, could not mount a coherent defense. Commanders, still operating under the assumption that this was only a minor distraction, hesitated to call for reinforcements. Even as they saw the Allies making steady progress, many still refused to acknowledge the full scope of the threat posed by the invasion. Some believed the landings would be a temporary setback, while others clung to the hope that reinforcements from elsewhere would turn the tide. Days passed and the Allies dug in. They took key positions along the beaches, expanded their foothold, and began to link up with resistance fighters inside France. The initial hours of surprise had given way to a broader campaign, and the Germans were now trapped in a desperate scramble to respond. But by then, it was too late. The decision to focus resources elsewhere, to dismiss Normandy as a mere diversion, had changed the course of the war. In those first few days, Germany had lost not just precious ground, but the initiative. And in war, the loss of initiative is often the most costly mistake of all. The realization of this blunder would not be immediate. But as the days turned into weeks and the Allies pushed further inland, the question became increasingly clear. Could Germany recover from this critical error? Or had the momentum of history already shifted beyond their reach? By early June 1944, the situation for the German forces in Normandy had become dire. What had started as a shock to their system, the sudden, massive Allied invasion, had swiftly evolved into a race against time. The beaches, once thought to be the final line of defense, were now strewn with the wreckage of the German forces' most formidable defenses. The Allies were digging in, expanding their positions with remarkable speed. Each day, new waves of soldiers and reinforcements flooded in, securing key towns, roads, and critical infrastructure. For the German generals, the urgency could not have been clearer. They were losing ground, and every hour spent scrambling for a response only deepened the peril they faced. Time was slipping away. In a desperate bid to regain the initiative, German engineers began to work around the clock, attempting to shore up defenses and develop new strategies to hold back the relentless Allied advance. The Atlantic Wall, once considered impenetrable, had been breached in several places, and the Germans had to adapt quickly. They created new defensive positions, relying on the strength of artillery, tanks, and newly constructed obstacles. But despite their best efforts, they were always a step behind. Their reliance on static defenses, those same fortifications they had once believed would secure victory, was proving ineffective against the rapid mobility of the Allied forces. The German leadership, once brimming with confidence, was now forced into a reactive mode, trying to adapt on the fly to a rapidly shifting battlefield. The irony of it all was almost poetic. Just a few days earlier, the Germans had been the ones dictating the terms of the war, their plans unfolding in a seemingly unstoppable march across Europe. But now, they found themselves scrambling. The technological superiority they had once relied upon was no longer enough. The Allies had taken the initiative, and Germany was now struggling to adapt to the pace of modern warfare. In the heat of the battle, the well-oiled machinery of the German war effort was being ground down by indecision and a lack of flexibility. The once confident commanders who had ordered the building of the Atlantic Wall now found themselves unable to move fast enough to repel the invaders. Compounding these difficulties was the utter failure of communication between the various German army groups. The command structure was fragmented, with officers at different levels unable to effectively coordinate their efforts. Information was slow to reach the front lines, and orders, when they came, were often unclear or contradictory. The paralysis of command only worsened the chaos on the ground. A lack of coordination between the army, the Luftwaffe, and the SS forces scattered across France meant that even when reinforcements were sent, they arrived too late or in the wrong places. This lack of unified action compounded the strategic disaster unfolding in Normandy, where the Allies were rapidly consolidating their hold on the beaches, pushing further inland with each passing day. Finally, as the German High Command realized the scale of the disaster, orders were given to reinforce Normandy. But by then, the window for meaningful intervention had long passed. The delay, the hesitation, had proven to be catastrophic. The German forces that arrived were either insufficient in numbers or spread too thin across multiple fronts. The Allies, meanwhile, had entrenched themselves in strategic positions, their supply lines secured and their numbers growing. The Germans, who had once believed they controlled the battlefield, now found themselves pushed back into a defensive posture. The initiative, once firmly in German hands, had shifted irreversibly to the Allies. In the days that followed, the consequences of the German High Command's failure to respond swiftly would become all too clear. The critical positions the Allies had secured on the beaches were now fortified, and their momentum seemed unstoppable. The Germans, unable to mount a cohesive response, watched as their last hopes for regaining control slipped further from their grasp. What had begun as a small crack in their defenses had grown into a full-scale collapse. As the Allies pressed on, securing more of France with each passing day, the question became clear. Could Germany turn the tide, or had their window for a successful defense already closed? The battle for Normandy was far from over, but the fate of the war in Europe had already taken a significant turn. The beaches of Normandy, once tranquil stretches of sand and surf, were now transformed into a deadly battleground. As the German forces rushed to contain the Allied invasion, they quickly found that the beaches were far more formidable than they had anticipated. The Allies, entrenched in their positions, were not easily dislodged. The landing zones, heavily fortified and well supplied, resisted every German attempt to break through. Despite their best efforts, the Germans were confronted with an overwhelming force, one that was prepared, determined, and capable of sustaining itself in the face of relentless opposition. The Allied forces, having established their beachheads, were not retreating. The struggle had shifted. The Germans, once so sure of their ability to repel any invader, now found themselves in a deadly race to prevent further Allied advances. There was a bitter irony in this turn of events. The German High Command had been convinced that the Atlantic Wall, with its fortified bunkers, coastal artillery, and mines, was a defense that no invasion could breach. They had prepared for this moment for years, believing that their defensive structures would hold back any force that dared to challenge them. Yet, as the first waves of Allied troops began to pour onto the beaches, the Atlantic Wall proved far less formidable than they had imagined. The sheer force of the Allied assault, combined with the devastating impact of Allied air superiority and relentless artillery bombardments, rendered the German defenses ineffective. The Atlantic Wall, once a symbol of German might, was being torn apart in real time, and the realization began to sink in. Their defensive strategy, built on concrete and steel, had failed. What followed was a brutal battle of attrition. The Germans tried to push back the Allies, but the situation was not in their favor. With each passing hour, the Allies reinforced their positions, bringing in more supplies, more men, and more artillery. The Germans, despite their initial resolve, were becoming increasingly outmatched. They could no longer stop the constant flow of Allied reinforcements, and as the days passed, the pressure mounted. Every time they made an advance, it was met with fierce counterattacks. The Allies, deeply motivated by the need to break free of the Nazi stranglehold over Europe, were not deterred. The sheer determination of the Allied soldiers, their unyielding will to push forward, proved to be the deciding factor. The Germans, no matter how much they fought, simply could not match the pace and scale of the Allied assault. As the battle raged on, it became clear that the Germans were caught in a fight they could not win. The Atlantic Wall had failed, and the invasion force was now firmly entrenched on French soil. The German High Command, once so sure of their ability to keep the Allies at bay, found themselves on the defensive. They could not push back the well-supplied and highly motivated Allied forces. As the Allies advanced further into Normandy, the Germans were left to confront the harsh truth. The invasion was no longer a threat they could contain. It was now a reality they could not reverse. The tide of war had decisively turned, and there was no longer any question as to who was in control. The Battle of Normandy would stretch on, but the ultimate defeat of the Germans seemed inevitable. The failure of the German defensive strategy had set the stage for an Allied victory that would soon be confirmed by the eventual liberation of France. But as the Germans retreated, one question lingered. Could they regroup in time to mount a counterattack? Or was this the beginning of the end for Nazi control in Western Europe? As the sun set on the beaches of Normandy, the Allies had gained a crucial foothold, but the war was far from over. In the coming days, the full weight of their victory would begin to take shape. As the sun rose on June 7, 1944, the battle for Normandy continued with brutal intensity. Despite several desperate German counterattacks, the Allies dug in, resolute, and ever-expanding their foothold. The beaches of Normandy, which had been the epicenter of chaos only a day earlier, were now a solid base from which the Allies launched relentless offensives. Day by day, they pressed deeper into German-held territory, inching toward their ultimate goal of liberating France and ultimately Europe. The sounds of war, the booming of artillery, the crackle of gunfire, the steady hum of Allied bombers above, were now the soundtrack of progress. Each movement forward was met with German resistance, but the Allies refused to yield. Every victory, however small, became a stepping stone toward a decisive victory that seemed increasingly within reach. The Germans, weary from the constant pressure and unable to mount a sustained response, began to face the harsh reality of their situation. The initial hope that they could repel the Allies, that they could drive them back into the sea, had all but evaporated. The Germans, exhausted by their counterattacks, realized with grim clarity that they had no reserves left to call upon. Their forces in Normandy were already stretched thin, and with each failed assault, their ability to launch any meaningful defense diminished. The once proud German military machine, so accustomed to swift, decisive actions, now found itself bogged down in a war of attrition, fighting on multiple fronts without the reinforcements necessary to change the course of battle. They had hoped that the Atlantic Wall would act as an unbreachable barrier, but that hope was now fading into the cold reality of defeat. The Allies had arrived with overwhelming force, and the Germans, despite their best efforts, could no longer stop the inevitable. As the Allies maintained constant pressure, the situation for the German forces became increasingly untenable. Each day, the Allies pushed deeper into Normandy, seizing vital strategic locations. The Germans, in their scattered and exhausted state, had little left to throw at the advancing troops. Their forces, spread across various sectors and hindered by poor communication, were unable to mount any cohesive resistance. What had begun as an invasion now felt like a juggernaut that the Germans could not halt. Every step the Allies took brought them closer to their goal, and with each key town liberated, the noose tightened around the German forces. It was no longer a question of whether the Allies would succeed, but when. The tide was turning, and Germany's chances of victory were dwindling rapidly. The turning point came when the Allies secured control of the skies above Normandy. For the first time, the Germans realized they had lost air superiority, a crucial advantage that had once allowed them to harass and disrupt the movements of enemy forces. With the Allied air forces dominating the skies, the German defenses were now vulnerable to constant bombardment. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin and underperforming, could no longer protect the vital positions the Germans held. The Allies, with their superior air power, were able to strike at will, decimating German supply lines, communication hubs, and reinforcements before they could even reach the front lines. This shift in the balance of power was pivotal. Without the ability to control the air, the Germans were left exposed. unable to respond to the rapidly advancing Allied forces. The revelation of this loss, the loss of the air, marked a true turning point in the battle. What had once seemed like an impossible gamble for the Allies was now turning into a victory they could see on the horizon. The invasion, which had started with uncertainty and peril, was now unfolding in their favor. Germany's defensive strategy, once so carefully crafted and seemingly invincible, was crumbling under the weight of constant Allied pressure. The Germans, unable to counterattack and without the reserves to mount a decisive defense, were now fighting a losing battle. The Allies, despite the initial hardships of the invasion, had gained the upper hand. They had secured a firm foothold in France, and the Germans, realizing the depth of their loss, began to wonder, could they possibly reverse this momentum, or had they already lost the war in Western Europe? As the Allies pressed forward, the Germans scrambled for answers, but it was already too late. The invasion of Normandy had turned the tide of the war. The path to victory was now clearer than ever before, and the Allies, determined and united, were preparing for what would be the final push toward victory in Europe. The question that remained was no longer whether the Allies could succeed, but how long the Germans could hold out before the inevitable collapse. As June unfolded, the battle for Normandy evolved from a desperate struggle to a relentless march of progress for the Allies. With each passing day, German forces found themselves fighting not just to hold their ground, but to survive. Every inch of land became a battlefield as Allied soldiers pushed forward, determined to break the German stranglehold on France. The once formidable German defenses, spread thin across a fractured command structure, were now crumbling. The Germans could no longer maintain a coordinated defense. What began as a swift reaction to the initial Allied assault had become a drawn-out engagement, where the strategic initiative had shifted beyond their grasp. With the loss of key towns and the advancing pressure from all directions, the German forces realized their position was no longer tenable. The question was no longer if they would lose. It was when and how their defeat would be realized. The irony of this moment was not lost on the German high command. After days of miscalculations and failed responses, German intelligence finally confirmed what they had long refused to acknowledge: Normandy was indeed the primary target. But by this point, the revelation came too late. The Allies had already established strongholds on the beaches, and their forces were moving rapidly inland. German commanders, once certain that any Allied landing would occur at the Pas-de-Calais, were now struggling to shift their forces to adjust their strategies. But it was all too slow. The Allies, having gained the initiative, were not waiting for the Germans to regroup. Each new town they secured, each vital piece of infrastructure they captured, was a nail in the coffin of German hopes. The balance had irreversibly tipped in favor of the Allies, and Germany's window for a meaningful counterattack had slammed shut. The turning point was clear. The Allies were not merely holding their positions in Normandy, they were expanding them at an accelerating pace. The German forces, unable to maintain any semblance of order, were falling back in disarray. Vital cities like Kärnten, Saint-Lô, and Caen were taken by the Allies, each one providing not only strategic advantages but psychological boosts to the advancing troops. As the Allies pushed deeper into France, they secured vital roads, railways, and supply lines, resources the Germans could no longer control. The Germans, once so confident in their defenses, were now watching helplessly as their carefully constructed positions were Verun, the ground beneath them, was slipping away, and with every passing hour, the prospect of a German victory seemed less and less likely. It was no longer a question of if the Allies would break through, but when. What was supposed to have been a temporary setback for the Allies, the invasion of Normandy, was now clearly marking the beginning of the end for Germany. The German forces had underestimated the scale and scope of the Allied assault, and their inability to respond in a timely, effective manner had sealed their fate. The Atlantic Wall, once their crowning achievement, had been shattered, and the myth of German invincibility lay in ruins. What the Allies had accomplished in just a matter of days had set the stage for their final push to victory. The psychological toll of the invasion's success could not be overstated. For the Germans, it wasn't just a matter of losing land. It was the loss of momentum, the collapse of morale, and the dawning realization that they were facing a war they could no longer win. The irony of it all was that what had been perceived as the opening chapter of the end of the Allies was, in fact, the beginning of the slow, inevitable collapse of the Third Reich. The Germans, after months of ruthless conquest across Europe, were now on the back foot. The Allies, whose forces had once been considered fragmented and ill-prepared for such a large-scale operation, had proved themselves not only capable but overwhelmingly effective. The German High Command's inability to properly assess the situation in Normandy, to realize the true scale of the invasion until it was too late, was their undoing. With every town that fell to the Allies, the dream of a victorious Germany became more distant, more impossible. The gamble that had seemed so certain of success had backfired in ways they could not have foreseen. The revelation of this failure was profound. The Germans had failed to anticipate the full scale of the D-Day invasion. They had underestimated the speed, the coordination, and the sheer will of the Allies to push forward. The failure to react quickly, to adjust to the changing tides of battle, had set the stage for their ultimate defeat. As the Allies surged deeper into France, the German forces found themselves not only fighting against an advancing enemy, but against their own inability to recover. The question now was no longer whether they could hold Normandy, but whether they could salvage anything from the ashes of their crumbling empire. And as the Allies pressed on, capturing more ground with each passing day, the Germans were left to reckon with a bitter truth. The moment they failed to react decisively in the first critical days of the invasion was the moment the war truly turned against them. Their fate was sealed, but the final chapters of the conflict were yet to be written. Would they regroup, or had they already passed the point of no return? As June 1944 wore on, the Allies pressed forward relentlessly. The beaches of Normandy, once a dangerous battleground, were now secure footholds, from which the Allies continued their march into the heart of France. The first few weeks of the invasion had shown the world that the Third Reich could be broken. The once mighty German war machine, which had dominated Europe for years, now found itself reeling. The Germans, who had hoped to repel the Allies and drive them back into the sea, were instead witnessing the slow, steady collapse of their defenses. Each day, the Allies pushed deeper into the occupied territories, securing vital towns, roads, and railways. With every inch they gained, the German ability to mount a meaningful defense diminished. The realization among the German High Command was inescapable. This war could not be won. The failure to contain the Normandy invasion marked the critical turning point in Germany's ability to wage war on the Western Front. The initial shock of D-Day had given way to an unstoppable momentum. The Germans, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the invasion, could no longer stem the tide of Allied forces pouring into France. Reinforcements arrived, but they were scattered and often too few to make a difference. The Germans found themselves unable to hold the line as the Allies, with their superior air power, logistics, and manpower, systematically dismantled the German defenses. Where the Germans had once stood at the apex of military power, they now found themselves on the defensive, scrambling to plug gaps in their lines that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. What had been a series of strategic miscalculations on the part of German command, the misjudgment of Normandy as a diversion, the failure to reinforce the area in time, now crystallized into a harsh reality. The war was lost. The arrogance of the German generals, their belief in the invincibility of the Atlantic Wall, their overconfidence in the strength of their positions, had blinded them to the full scale of the Allied threat. They had underestimated the Allies' ability to coordinate such a massive invasion, and even more critically, they had underestimated the resolve of the men who fought on the ground. The German leadership, so used to imposing its will on Europe, now found itself scrambling to react to an enemy it could no longer control. The irony of the situation was bitter. These were the same generals who, just months earlier, had led the German military with a confidence that seemed unshakable. They had conquered much of Europe, and their forces had pushed deep into the Soviet Union. But now, as the Allies advanced, they could do little more than slow the inevitable. They had failed to anticipate the rapid, decisive force the Allies could bring to bear. Even with reinforcements, with the last vestiges of their strength being poured into Normandy, the Germans were unable to push back. The vast machinery of war they had so carefully built, with its tanks, its planes, its strategic fortifications, was no match for the combined might of the Allies, who were fighting with an unrelenting drive. And the Germans knew, deep down, that the war was slipping away from them. The moral irony was undeniable. The same generals who had once commanded respect for their strategic brilliance were now victims of their own overconfidence. They had believed the Allies would never be able to launch such a large-scale operation in the face of their defenses. They had assumed that the Atlantic Wall was a permanent shield, impervious to Allied firepower. But in the end, It was their inability to adapt, to shift their thinking and respond to the changing tides of war that sealed their fate. The Germans had been caught in a moment of complacency, unable to grasp the true scope of the Allied effort. And now, as the Allies pushed further into France, it became clear that the collapse of the Nazi war machine was no longer a question of if, but when. By late June, the German forces were no longer engaged in a battle for victory. They were fighting to avoid complete annihilation. With each town lost, with each line broken, the Germans were forced to pull back. The Allies' advance was no longer a distant hope. It was an unstoppable force. The German generals, once so confident in their ability to control the battlefield, now faced the harsh truth. Their miscalculations, their refusal to acknowledge the scale of the threat before them, had led to the destruction of their military strength in the West. The collapse was imminent, and no matter how many reinforcements were thrown into the fray, it was clear that the Allies held the strategic advantage. The question now was simple. Could Germany even survive the coming storm, or was the war already decided in Normandy? What was once a war of conquest for the Nazis had become a desperate struggle for survival. And as the Allies advanced, the final chapters of the war were being written. By the summer of 1944, the situation for Nazi Germany had become dire. As the Allies advanced, the once proud defenses of the German military were slowly but surely collapsing under the relentless pressure of a determined enemy. The German forces, now stretched thin, fought desperately to hold onto territory, but their efforts were becoming increasingly futile. Every defensive line that had once seemed unbreakable was now riddled with cracks. The Allied push was inexorable. From the beaches of Normandy, where the tide of battle had turned in their favor, to the heart of France, the Allies were closing in. The German military, worn down by months of war on multiple fronts, could no longer muster the strength to halt the advancing tide. The realization of defeat loomed large over the German command. What had once been a campaign of swift victories, a vision of the Third Reich's unassailable dominance, was now unraveling. The war's outcome was sealed. The Allies were no longer on the defensive, they were on the offensive, pushing deeper into the heart of Europe. Paris was within their grasp. The iconic city, long held under the grip of Nazi occupation, would soon be liberated. In the streets, the first whispers of the city's liberation stirred among the French resistance, signaling the imminent collapse of the Nazi occupation. For the German military, the loss of Paris was symbolic of the broader defeat that was unfolding across the continent. The Allies had secured the strategic initiative, and the German forces could only scramble to delay the inevitable. What had once seemed impossible, the breaking of the German defenses, was now a reality. The Atlantic Wall, that symbol of Nazi strength, had been breached. The German military, once so confident in their ability to hold off any invasion, was now caught in a struggle for survival. The German generals, who had long relied on their well-laid plans and the superiority of their technology, found themselves in a fight they could no longer control. The failure of the high command. To adapt to the realities of modern warfare had become glaringly apparent. They had underestimated the Allied resolve and the scale of their operations. The inability to reinforce the Normandy front in time had allowed the Allies to gain momentum. Now, that momentum was unstoppable. As the Allies pushed closer to Paris, the German military was scrambling. The once mighty forces of the Wehrmacht had lost their cohesion, their strength drained by months of constant battle. Commanders, unsure of how to counter the Allied advance, were issuing orders that were often too little, too late. The German defensive lines, once thought impenetrable, were now fragile and crumbling under the weight of relentless Allied attacks. What had been one of the most formidable fighting forces in the world now found itself retreating, unable to hold back the tide of history. Each day, the Allies advanced further, reclaiming land and strategic positions with precision and speed. The Germans, in a futile effort to slow the inevitable, dug in wherever they could, but their positions were no longer secure. The battle was no longer for victory. It was a desperate attempt to delay the end. The moral victory of the Allies in these final hours was undeniable. The tide of war had shifted irreversibly in their favor. What had seemed like a remote possibility just months earlier, the defeat of Nazi Germany, was now a certainty. The Allies were not only poised to liberate France, they were on the doorstep of Germany itself. The defeat of the Third Reich, once an abstract concept, was now a tangible reality. The failure of the German high command to adapt to the shifting dynamics of the war had sealed their fate. Their overconfidence, their inability to make critical decisions in the face of overwhelming evidence had led to their downfall. The cost of those mistakes was now clear. The Allies had won, and Nazi Germany was on the brink of collapse. As the Allies drew closer to Paris, the German military was already in retreat, their power shattered, their unity broken. The end of Nazi Germany was now in sight, and there was no longer any question of whether the Allies would succeed. The war in Europe was nearing its final chapter. But as the streets of Paris were liberated and the German forces were pushed back, one question remained. Would Germany's collapse come quickly, or would the horrors of war continue to spread across Europe for just a little longer? In the shadow of the Allies' advance, the fate of Europe and the world was hanging in the balance. The end was near, but the final hours of the Reich had yet to unfold. By the fall of 1944, the momentum of war had unmistakably shifted. The failed German response to D-Day, once considered a fleeting setback, had now become a symbol of the beginning of the end for the Nazi war effort. The Allied forces, having secured Normandy and broken through the French defenses, were now pressing into Germany itself. The map of Europe was no longer dominated by the Axis powers. It was increasingly painted with the advancing colors of liberation. Each day, the Allies pushed further into German-held territory, and the once formidable Wehrmacht was forced to retreat. But the collapse of Nazi defenses was not simply a matter of military might. It was the consequence of strategic failures, compounded by a hubris that had become Germany's fatal flaw. The moral irony of Germany's defeat could not be overstated. What began as a massive, seemingly insurmountable empire was undone not by lack of resources or manpower, but by overconfidence and the refusal to adapt to a changing world. The German high command had believed they were invincible, secure behind their Atlantic wall, their tanks, and their air superiority. They dismissed the possibility that the Allies, despite years of preparation and setbacks, would successfully launch a full-scale invasion. When the Allies did just that, the Germans, in their arrogance, failed to adapt swiftly. They underestimated the scale of the assault, the speed of the response, and most critically, the resilience of the Allied forces. This stubbornness, this refusal to accept the reality of the changing war, was the true cause of Germany's defeat on the Western Front. The lessons learned in Normandy were pivotal, not only for the victory in France but for the subsequent campaigns in Europe. The Allies, buoyed by their success, refined their strategies in ways that would ensure future victories. In Normandy, they had learned the importance of surprise, of overwhelming force, and of rapid adaptability. They had demonstrated that coordinated attacks, on land, sea, and air, could break even the most hardened defenses. The German failure to adapt had exposed their vulnerability, and now the Allies, using the lessons of Normandy, were poised to carry that momentum all the way to the heart of Germany. The battle for Europe had entered a new phase, one in which the Germans no longer held the initiative. The tide of war, once in their favor, was now irrevocably against them. The war's ultimate victory, however, was not simply the result of superior firepower or brute force. It was the culmination of a deeper, more profound shift, the ability to learn from mistakes, to adapt to an evolving battlefield, and to outthink an opponent whose overconfidence blinded them to the realities of war. The Allies had been tested at every turn, but their ability to reassess and adjust gave them the edge. For the Germans, their failure to do the same, whether in their response to the D-Day landings or in their refusal to accept the strategic shift, became the gravest of errors. These mistakes would echo through the war's final chapters, as the Allies continued their advance, breaking through German defenses that had once seemed unassailable. For the German generals, the failure to respond effectively to the invasion would haunt them for the rest of the conflict. The mistakes they made in those crucial first days after D-Day, when they misread the scale of the attack and failed to act decisively, paved the way for their eventual downfall. These errors would become emblematic of a wider failure in leadership, one that allowed a well-prepared, determined enemy to exploit every weakness. The loss of Normandy was the beginning of a series of defeats that would only grow more pronounced as the Allies moved closer to Germany's heart. With each mistake, the prospect of victory for the Nazis grew more remote, while the Allied victory became an inevitability. In the end, it wasn't just the soldiers who fought on the front lines that determined the war's outcome. It was the strategic decisions made by the high command that sealed the fate of nations. The German leadership's inability to read the changing tides of war, their failure to adapt their strategy, and their overconfidence in their own invincibility had led them to ruin. The Allies' ability to outmaneuver their enemies, to adapt on the fly, and to learn from each engagement was the key to their success. The question remained: how much longer could the German military hold on before their entire war effort collapsed under the weight of their own mistakes? And as the Allies closed in on Germany's borders, the moral victory was clear. The war was no longer a question of if the Allies would win. It was a matter of when. The outcome had been determined by the strategic decisions made not only on the battlefield, but by the commanders who guided their forces. It was these decisions, more than any single battle or offensive, that had set the stage for the fall of Nazi Germany. The end was drawing near, but the final chapters were still to be written. By 1945, the end of the Third Reich was no longer a distant hope. It was an inescapable reality. Germany's fate had been sealed years earlier, not by a single battle or a single decision, but by a series of miscalculations that began with the failed response to D-Day. The invasion of Normandy, initially viewed by the German High Command as a temporary setback, had ultimately become the moment that broke the back of Nazi Germany's war machine. What they had dismissed as a diversionary tactic turned into the beginning of their downfall. Each day after June 6, 1944, the Germans found themselves on the defensive, and every strategic mistake they made brought them closer to collapse. The Allies, with their superior numbers, resources, and unified command, pressed forward relentlessly, capturing one key position after another. In the end, it was not just military might that would bring down the Third Reich, but the Germans' failure to see the changing tides of war. The irony of it all was striking. For years, the German generals had been confident in their ability to hold Europe, to repel any invasion, and to defend the fortress Europe they had built. The Atlantic Wall, their last great defensive measure, was considered unbreachable. Yet, when the Allies finally did land in Normandy, the Germans failed to recognize the scale and determination of the operation. They did not act quickly enough, and their hubris, believing the Allies could never muster such a formidable force, meant that when they finally understood the scope of the threat, it was too late. Their defensive strategy, once the cornerstone of their military might, crumbled in the face of a well-coordinated, overwhelming assault. Every strategic error, from misjudging the scale of the invasion to failing to adapt to the speed of Allied reinforcements, played into the hands of the Allies, who had learned from their past mistakes and executed their strategy with precision. The cost of this arrogance was catastrophic. As the Allies continued to push through France, liberating city after city, the German leadership could only watch as their once unstoppable forces were driven back. The war, which had once seemed within their grasp, was slipping through their fingers. The Germans, desperate to maintain control, made one last push to reinforce their defenses, but it was futile. Even with reinforcements, they were no longer in control of the battlefield. The Allied forces, now united in purpose and deeply motivated by the knowledge that victory was within reach, continued to gain ground at an astonishing rate. The slow, methodical destruction of the Nazi war machine began to accelerate, and as the Allies crossed into Germany itself, the reality of the Reich's collapse became undeniable. For the German High Command, the consequences of their failure to adapt were immediate and absolute. The resistance that once seemed insurmountable was now crumbling under the weight of Allied pressure. With every town the Allies liberated, with every defensive position the Germans lost, it became clearer that their defeat was imminent. But what began as the Allies' most difficult struggle, an invasion against the seemingly impregnable Atlantic Wall, had now become the moment that would define the entire war. The Allies had forced their way onto the shores of France, and through their persistence, they had changed the course of history. D-Day, the event the German generals believed would fail, became the critical turning point, the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. By early 1945, the question was no longer if Germany would surrender, but when, and under what terms. With the Allies advancing from the west and the Soviet forces pushing from the east, Germany had no choice but to face the reality of its defeat. The once mighty Reich, built on conquest and terror, was crumbling. The total collapse of Nazi Germany was not just the result of military power, but the inevitable consequence of strategic blindness. The failure to adapt to the ever-evolving war, to respond to new tactics and a united enemy, had led to the Reich's downfall. The generals' hubris, their refusal to acknowledge the full scale of the Allied assault, had been their greatest mistake. In those final days, as the Allies moved toward Berlin, the enormity of the loss became painfully clear. The war that had been built on grand ambitions, on the belief that the Nazis could dominate Europe forever, was now ending in utter destruction. The German High Command, once brimming with confidence, was left to watch as the war they had hoped to win slipped irreparably from their grasp. Their mistakes would echo throughout history as a reminder of the costs of overconfidence, of the failure to adapt to the realities of war. The fall of the Third Reich was inevitable, and it had been written in the fateful decision to ignore the lessons of Normandy. As Germany faced its inevitable surrender, the question lingered: how would the world rebuild after the ashes of the Third Reich? And what would history say of the decisions that led to the downfall of one of the most powerful empires the world had ever known? The final chapters were unfolding, and soon the world would have to reckon with the consequences of the Nazi regime's arrogance. The war was almost over, but its legacy would last for generations. D-Day was more than a military operation. It was a moment that changed the course of history. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched their invasion of Normandy with precision and determination, but it was a moment that Germany's high command believed would fail. Their overconfidence had led them to dismiss the possibility of such an audacious assault. For months, the Germans had been convinced that the Atlantic Wall, the system of fortifications built to defend against any invasion, was impenetrable. And so, when the Allies finally struck, the German generals, still confident in their defenses, struggled to process what was happening. They laughed at the notion that the Allies would dare to land on the beaches of Normandy, believing it was merely a diversion. They never laughed again. The revelation was stark. D-Day marked the pivotal point in the war when Germany's strategic arrogance led directly to its defeat. For years, Nazi Germany had been the undisputed power in Europe, dominating battlefields with its military prowess. But D-Day shattered that image. It exposed a critical flaw in the German command, an inability to see the Allies for what they had become. A unified, resolute force capable of launching the most complex and massive invasion the world had ever seen. The generals, who had once led the charge across Europe, had become prisoners of their own hubris. They failed to recognize the true scale of the threat before them. Their mistaken belief that the Allies could never successfully invade was not just a miscalculation. It was the final misstep that would unravel everything they had fought to build. The irony of this failure was undeniable. The German generals had placed their faith in a defense system that, despite its scale, was static and ill-suited for the fast-moving, multifaceted warfare of the 20th century. They had underestimated not just the scale of the invasion, but the sheer determination of the Allied forces, who had the resources, willpower, and unity to press forward in ways the Germans could not fathom. The failure to quickly adapt to the changing realities of the war left Germany vulnerable, and once the Allies established their beachheads, there was no turning back. What began as a bold and unexpected offensive now seemed like a well-oiled campaign that would bring the Nazi regime to its knees. In the aftermath of the invasion, the Germans were left with one bitter truth: overconfidence had become their greatest weakness. The Allies had proven that belief in invincibility could be the very thing that brought down an empire. The success of D-Day was not just about military superiority. It was about the ability to take risks, to recognize opportunity, and most crucially, to act when it mattered most. The Germans, so certain of their dominance, failed to understand the nature of the war they were fighting. Their hesitation, their unwillingness to adjust their strategy, ultimately led to their downfall. The Allies' victory on D-Day demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the strength of your army. It's the courage to act decisively, even when the odds seem overwhelming. The ultimate lesson of the war was this: the turning point doesn't always come from the most obvious weapon or tactic. Sometimes, it's in the decision to act when it counts most. The Allies' success on D-Day wasn't just about the landings themselves, but about the broader strategy that saw them embrace uncertainty and risk, while Germany held fast to outdated beliefs that had already failed them. The German generals, entrenched in their own certainty, failed to recognize the changing tides of war. They failed to act when they needed to, and it was that inaction more than anything that sealed their fate. The Germans were wrong. D-Day was not a failure. It was the moment that changed the course of the war. It was the moment when the Allies demonstrated their ability to adapt, to evolve, and to launch an assault that would break the back of the Nazi war machine. For the Germans, That moment would mark the beginning of their collapse, a failure that could never be undone. And as the Allies pressed forward, their momentum unstoppable, one question remained. Could the German military ever hope to recover from their fatal mistake? Or had the war, in that single moment on the beaches of Normandy, already been lost?